The president, who says he's been tougher on Russia than any president ever, just won a narrow vote in the Senate to ease sanctions on companies tied to a Russian billionaire with close connections to the Kremlin. We're just halfway into a week that began with some serious people in and out of government asking whether a U.S. president might be some kind of unwitting or witting Russian asset. And today, over the objection of quite a few Republicans, the Senate fell short of the votes needed to block the easing of sanctions on companies tied to Oleg Deripaska.
This guy's a bad news. He's a tyrant, he's a pirate, he's a gangster. And he's hurting the Russian people every day, and he's trying to hurt America. And we got him down. I said, let's choke him. I'm not going to let him up.
A number of Senator Kennedy's fellow Republicans agreed. Most did not, and the Trump administration certainly did not, sending Treasury Secretary Mnuchin up to the Hill yesterday to lobby against the measure. To lobby against it, we should add, just days after those two remarkable stories, one on the FBI back in 2017, launching a counterintelligence investigation of the president's actions, and the other, first reported in the Washington Post, on the lengths that President Trump went to conceal what he and Vladimir Putin discussed at the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany, also in 2017. That is the summit where, in case you're wondering, we learned today that after it was over, the president told a New York Times reporter he believed Putin when he said Russia didn't attack the 2016 election. It's also the summit where this moment is getting renewed attention. The president giving this series of gestures, apparently to Vladimir Putin, as Putin was speaking. Unclear exactly what it meant. Sort of looked like kind of a you and me guy, a fist of solidarity, perhaps. You can interpret it as you will. It's the same summit where the president met with Putin, and afterwards he took the interpreter's notes. And that, as you know, is just one of many incidents or utterances, actions, tweets, and policy changes that, fairly or not, have raised suspicions. Just to be fair, we should also point out that the Constitution gives the president almost total discretion to conduct foreign policy. That said, knowing the suspicions, and this dates back even to the campaign, the president has made little or no effort to allay concerns that, just as it seemed to be in Hamburg, Vladimir Putin and President Trump are on the same wavelength, eye to eye, on the same page. Now the Kremlin appears to be stirring the pot. Here's what Russia's foreign minister today said about the notion that President Trump is some sort of asset.
Honestly, to be frank with you, it's hard for me to comment on what happens in the United States around the accusations of Mr. Trump that he is a Russian agent. In fact, I think it is just for the American media such disparaging of the standards of journalism and such an ungrateful thing.
Russian minister talking about the status of good journalism, in other words, fake news. Now, stop me if you've heard that one before. In fact, if you believe President Trump, no president has ever been as tough on Russia as he's been. And though he's never named them, that means tougher than, I guess, Harry Truman, who confronted Moscow after their blockade of Berlin in 1948, tougher than John F. Kennedy, who went to the nuclear brink during the Cuban Missile Crisis, tougher than Ronald Reagan. In reality, today, we learned this president and his administration couldn't even see their way to getting tough with a Russian businessman who's a friend of the Kremlin. Not that it should raise suspicions or anything, just ask Russia.
There's a prosecutor Mueller is operating for 2 years now. He interrogated hundreds of people. No leaks that would confirm the accusation of the conspiracy between Trump and Russian Federation.
But nothing to see here. Now, the official translation on the Russian Foreign Ministry website does not use the word conspiracy, as the interpreter on that video does. Their choice? Well, I'll let the president say it. Our president, that is.
They found no collusion whatsoever with Russia. There has been no collusion. They won't find any collusion. It doesn't exist.
There's no collusion with me and the Russians. Nobody's been tougher to Russia.
There was no collusion. No collusion, which I knew anyway. No coordination, no nothing.
Well, that's not true. No other administration until now has seen a national security advisor charged with and pleading guilty to lying about contacts with Russians. No campaign chairman until now has ever been tied to a whole string of sleazy Russian and Russia-connected characters. No president until now has openly trashed the NATO alliance and reportedly talked repeatedly behind closed doors about pulling out of NATO. Whatever's going on is something, perhaps benign, perhaps ill-judged, perhaps all within the president's constitutional and legal authority, or maybe not. Just what kind of something it is, we don't know. Two presidents do, however, President Trump and Vladimir Putin. With all that on the table, I spoke a short time ago with Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, new chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. First of all, Mr. Chairman, what's your reaction to the Kremlin saying, kind of ridiculing the idea that candidate Donald Trump or President Trump was an asset or could be an asset for Russia. I mean, it's interesting to hear them kind of ridiculing this notion.
It is. This is such an otherworldly situation where you've got the Kremlin denying that the President of the United States was working as an agent for them.
And echoing the whole sort of fake news, argument as well. They say, it's bad journalism.
Oh, yes. And, well, we've heard Lavrov from time to time use what looks like the exact same talking points as Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But it's worth also remembering that the Kremlin is more than capable and has put out disinformation on this very issue time after time. The most interesting to me was when we learned from Michael Cohen recently that the Trump Tower Moscow deal, which initially the president had denied any business dealings, and then they admitted there was a deal, but it ended in January, that the effort to make that deal happen went all the way till June of 2016. And it was revealed that they had sought the Kremlin's assistance. The Kremlin had denied that. The Kremlin had said, we never followed up on that, we never had any contact. Now, the Kremlin was on the other end of that transaction, Dmitry Peskov, and we would learn from Michael Cohen that, in fact, no, they had responded. And so the Kremlin has helped Trump and his organization cover up contacts with them. So that tells us how much we can rely on the Kremlin talking points.
Also, when you see every time that the president has actually met with Vladimir Putin, it does just raise more questions. I mean, you would think for this president in particular, he would want other people in the room, other officials, given the allegations against him, given the suspicions at the very least, he would want somebody else there with, to be able to record for posterity what actually was discussed. But that's not been the case.
That's exactly right, and particularly if he was going to confront Putin on their intervention in our election, or he moved on to others, he would want others to be able to say, "Oh, I watched the president, take Putin to task," but of course he didn't want any of that, and it kind of beggars the imagination, why this desire for private, secret conversations with Putin.
Do you think the FBI was right to, the New York Times reporting that after the firing of Comey, they opened up. They started looking into whether the president could be compromised?
I can't confirm that report. I can't speak to that.
If that, in fact, is true, though, is that something you think would have been justified?
Well, I can certainly tell you that our primary concern from the beginning was a counterintelligence concern, initially about those around Donald Trump and then certainly about Donald Trump himself. And that continues to this day. And indeed, the more the president acts in the Russian interest, these revelations that he wanted to withdraw from NATO and kept bringing up withdrawing from NATO. I mean, that is an idea so much at odds with our national security interests on a very bipartisan basis. There's recognition of the tremendous value to our security that it's all the more inexplicable in the absence of some compromise.
You and the majority on your committee now have subpoena power. Do you intend to try to subpoena the interpreter or get the notes? It's my understanding, I believe there's been some reporting that the president actually took the notes that the interpreter had, so I don't know if any notes actually currently exist. But is that something, do you want to pursue this?
We do want to pursue this, and I've been in discussions with my counterparts on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Engel. We've been consulting with the lawyers also. What is the best case? What arguments might the White House make? It looks to me on the surface that they don't have much of an executive privilege case to make. That privilege really normally applies when the president is seeking advice from his counselors. And there's a policy interest in making sure that he has the free and unfettered opinion of those. That's not the case when he's speaking to a foreign leader, and he's speaking to that foreign leader in private. And so I don't think the privilege applies, but we want to make sure that we're on the strongest possible ground. If the president destroyed any record of that meeting, that's a separate issue and a separate problem that gives us further potential jurisdiction to get answers.
So does that mean you could subpoena the interpreter, or you would?
Well, we certainly could subpoena the interpreter. We could subpoena the interpreter's notes. The question is, on what basis will they refuse? Because they will refuse. And what is our chance of success on that? And I think we have to look at, is there a method for us to get that information voluntarily? Is there a way for us to assure the country that the president behind closed doors is not sacrificing the interests of the country. It's always our preference to get voluntary cooperation before we consider compulsion.
Chairman Schiff, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to talk about this now. Senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson is with us. CNN political analyst David Gergen, Gloria Borger, who's worked for David Gergen has worked for Republican and Democratic presidents alike, including one unindicted co-conspirator. Also, USA Today columnist and CNN political analyst Kirsten Powers, former RNC chief of staff Mike Shields, and the Obama Solicitor General Neil Katyal. Neil, just from a legal standpoint, can the White House make a valid executive privilege argument on the interpreter's notes?
They can try, but I think they're going to lose. Basically, the executive privilege comes back all the way to George Washington. He asserted it in 1792 with respect to the Indians. He lost there and had to turn over the information. Most presidents who've asserted executive privilege have lost. And for reasons that Congressman Schiff said, this isn't the greatest case because it's not one of communications between the president and his advisors.